objects because like the upside down frisbees in 2013 didn't actually come out to be.
Right. Yeah. A lot of we'll get to when we start talking about prototyping and things. We'll get to how we actually do testing and things like that. But just playing with the game object, whatever the game object is every year, if you're around it enough, you get really good with it. You can start doing in 2013, do all sorts of frisbee tricks and stuff because you just have them in your hand all the time. The different balls and things we've had in different years. Okay. Question?
When the people were playing as the robots, did they have straight faces the
No.
whole time?
I mean, a few of them were very, very concentrated on what they were doing and as being the robot, but most of the time they're laughing hysterically and barely able to like keep crawling. Okay, yeah.
Alright. Right there, just the frame perimeter is 112 inches.
Yes.
So does that mean that it doesn't
I
have
mean, I just got to that slide. I very much plan to explain that. Give me 1 second. Okay, so robot rules and inspection. As an LRI, like I said earlier, please, please, please read the robot rules. Also on your table should be an inspection checklist from last year. I hope, yeah, there it exists. All right, so the inspection checklist is a one-page document that pretty much covers all of the robot rules, or at least the most important robot rules. It definitely doesn't cover all of them in detail by any means, but it's just a way for the inspectors to go through and make sure you have a safe and operable robot. It'll change this year pretty dramatically because we have a whole new control system, so a lot of the one from last year is about certain things that happened with the old control system. But very much make sure that you can go through and you actually understand everything that's happening in that document. Several people on your team should know everything that's on it. There's really minor stuff that can hold you up from competing. If you don't have your pressure vent valve set to the right value and you're using pneumatics, you're not able to compete until that happens. So it's better if you have that all done, ready to go, well before you get to the regional. If you have any questions, I'm happy. There's plenty of times during the season where we have events here where if you bring your robot, I'll go through it and inspect it for you. Like we do all sorts of things like that to help you get ready before the event as much as possible. So we're not having to make those dramatic changes at the event because they take so much more time when you're not in your shop, you're not with all your tools, with all your parts, all that kind of thing. Okay, some of the basic ones that for the most part stick around. Again, any rule that I'm talking about first could change and likely will. But for the most part, they've been around for long enough to where we can at least discuss them and they're worth knowing about. The frame perimeter for the last 2 years has defined by that little word of 112-inch frame perimeter, which basically means your robot has to be a polygon without any concave areas in it, greater than a certain distance. And when you wrap a string around that polygon and you measure it, it can't be any longer than 112 inches. So if you make a circle that has a 112-inch perimeter, you get the largest area you could. If you build a square, you get pretty decent. You start getting rectangles, you get less and less area, things like that. It used to be, no, that's without bumpers. Bumpers go, so the frame perimeter sits between the robot and the bumpers. Your bumpers mount to your frame perimeter. In the official rules and things, it details this very much. There's a lot of explicit images and graphics and all of that to talk about it as well. And we can go over it more later if we need to. But in general, just know that's roughly your size constraint is 112 inches.
What are the bumper rules for a circular robot?
It has to cover it completely in the last couple of years. You weren't allowed to have any gaps. Because it was an infinite corner robot. Okay. The rule that probably has been around the longest is robots have to be 100, well, one of the rules has been around the longest, 120 pounds without bumpers and battery. That's been that way since 2004, 2005-ish. So probably one that could very likely change, just because First likes messing with teams. And if everyone gets used to building 120-pound robots, at some point they can be like, no, we're building 100-pound robots now. And that will mess with a lot of people. They did that when they changed frame perimeter. We had been building 28 by 38 by 5 feet tall robots for a really long time. Then they're like, nope, 112 inches now. And that dramatically changed people because veteran teams had chassis that they had liked designing and had built and had CAD for a very long time. They were all set to one size and they were like, can't use it anymore, redesign, make it smaller. make it fit. It'll be okay. So that put a lot of people a little behind that build season compared to where they would like to be. The rules also contain all the stuff about the control system, very specific things about wiring, pneumatics. Every type of wire that's on your robot has to be a certain gauge based on how much current it's going through. Most of those rules, all of those rules are there for safety reasons. If you have a wire that's not the right gauge, it is extremely easy to have it start catching on fire on your robot. We don't want fire on the field. That's one of the things we really try to avoid is fire anywhere on the field. So they're not there just to be nitpicky. They're there really for your safety, for our safety, for the safety of all the volunteers, other teams' robots. I don't want my robot near a robot on fire. I don't think you want your robot near a robot on fire either. It's just not safe for anybody. So make sure you're following all of those wiring rules. You're using the right wire, using the right pneumatic setups, all of those types of things. If you ever have questions about them, please contact me, another veteran team who's been doing it a while. They can give you all the answers you need to know about that. Okay, any other questions about the general aspects of the game rules? I'm going to let you guys go back into it and start reading through the rules in more detail if you need to. But for the most part, as long as you know how to score for what we're doing today, you don't need to know everything. But in the real rule book, please read every single rule. You really do need them all. They're important. Any other questions? Scoring makes some sense. Kind of how that works? Okay. All right. Step 2 of the design process is the design constraints and functional requirements. So basically the idea is, you want to go through without thinking about what the robot's going to necessarily look like. You want to look at all the different aspects to play the game and all the different ways that you can score points, what your robot can do, things like that, all of the what. So you want to play, obviously, some of the design constraints that every team has to do. You have to play within the game rules. Like I said, if you're building a robot that shoots frisbees and we're playing this game, you're going to have a really bad year. You must be able to build and implement the strategy. Design limits, physics exist. Don't build robots that just magically levitate. Don't build robots that weigh nothing, even though that material doesn't exist. You have real limitations on things. Cost, materials, tools, all of that we talked about in step 0 all go into this. Figure out what those constraints are. You also have to be able to pass inspection. That means your robot has to be within size, has to be within weight. You have to use certain motors that are allowed within the kit, all of that kind of thing as well.
Is it technically allowed to build a flying robot?
There hasn't been a rule against it. However, power to weight ratio stuff pretty much means physically it's impossible. I've never done the math, but I'm pretty sure it's impossible.
Okay.
Unless your robot's really tiny.
Well, no, but there's required things you have to have on the robot.
Safety will probably come into it. Like if you lose control of the robot and it flies out into the audience, they probably won't allow it.
Right, so it depends on what your definition of flying is and a bunch of other things. In general, though, the requirements to have a battery that only has a certain amount of energy in it compared to its weight, things like that, means you're not getting off the ground. Okay. Functional requirements are a little bit different than your design constraints. Those are things you get to decide, right? There's no rule that says your robot has to move. You could build a robot that doesn't move. In 2013, there were teams that did build robots without drivetrains. Probably a mistake. Looking back at it, you probably don't want to do that. But teams did it. They went through their strategy analysis and said, we don't need to drive. We can score enough points without moving. They'll make this work. How many points you want to score and how you're going to do that. Those are choices that are left up to your team and your analysis. And how you want to implement a strategy to get those points to do anything like that. The more specific you are in this point, the better. Actually knowing how fast you want to drive instead of just saying, I want to drive fast. How many points you want to score in a match instead of score a lot of points, score more points, whatever. If you're really specific here, you can design your robots and your strategies to get to those numbers. In certain things, what was I looking at? No, that's not useful. Okay. So right now, let's go ahead and have people start looking at making. Is that how I want to do it right now? Yes. Okay, yeah, let's have people basically start making lists of what you think the robots need to be able to do and how they want to be able to do it. And then we'll prioritize them as well. Did they not get blank paper? They're supposed to have blank paper. And he goes through a lot of the same material and how you're actually designing strategies to work well. One of them is to always build within your team's limits. And we're going to keep harping on this point. We talked about it in step 0 is evaluating what your resources are. Knowing what you can actually accomplish and figuring out what that is. You want to push yourselves, obviously, but you don't want to push yourself so far to where every single thing you're doing is going to require you to do something brand new that you've never done. If you're a team that's been around a while and you're just like, okay, this year we're just going to build the most complicated drivetrain and the most complicated arm and the most complicated everything and everything's going to be great, you're probably setting yourself up for failure in that the odds of all of those things working perfectly are very, very hard. If you go, oh, our arm's going to be really complicated, but we're going to build a similar drivetrain to something we built last year, we know we can probably get it to work. That's probably a better option. Avoid building unnecessarily complex functions. Does anyone know what KISS stands for? There we go. All right. So keeping it simple is very important in most engineering things you're doing, more important in FRC when you only have 45 days to build a robot. If you can do something with only one moving joint and instead somebody's like, oh, it's really cool if we have 7, you probably want to go with the one that can do it in 1. As you get more experience in it, though, you can start pushing boundaries, figuring out, okay, maybe if we do this, we can be, we're good at this level, but we can be really good if we push a little bit harder. Golden rule number 2, and the one that a lot of teams miss early on, is the games have a lot of tasks in them. Like this game, there's a ton of stuff you can do, all the tubes and things like that. You want to make sure that it's better most of the time to focus on one of those things than to do everything kind of poorly. So if you have a robot that kind of has ramps and kind of has an arm and kind of has a claw, but none of it really works all that well and you're not able to use it very well, you're not going to be nearly as valuable to your alliance as a robot that just has a really, really rock solid ramp and that's all it does. So in that example, if your team has 30 units, it's better to build 3 things that are 10 out of 10 than to have 5 things that are 6 out of 10. Because you are playing a team sport, right? So there's a lot of things you can do in a football game to contribute to your team, but it doesn't make any sense for any one person on the football team to be able to do all of them really well. They can't play every position. If your quarterback's also your best offensive lineman, that's never going to work. Okay. One of the pretty common ways that we rank specifications is by going through and putting them into 3 different categories: wish, preferred, and demand. Demand are things that you absolutely must do. Basically, your robot is terrible if you're not hitting demand. A lot of times when we're defining our demand, we also figure out what we think our minimum score is. So this past year, if you weren't able to get at least probably 2 assists and get the ball in the low goal with your robot, you needed to do something else to where you could figure out how to do it. Because there were, we'll talk a little bit later about what the robot in 3 days is, but there's robots that are already designed that you could build a very similar one to that could very quickly do some of those things. So if you're a robot where you thought you were doing something really well, but you weren't getting the points where you wanted to go, it's probably better just to cut it all off, put it over in the corner, and build something else that will able to get you those demand points. Preferred are things that are nice. They'll put you into, hopefully in like the elimination rounds. Wish are things that are going to make you an elite robot. So in terms of drive speed, demand, you're saying if we're not moving 6 feet per second, something's really wrong. Our drive chain's all messed up and crooked, and we're wasted. We're really inefficient. Nothing's working well. We're probably having an issue if we're not hitting at least that. Preferred is about average speed, and wish is you want to be able to be really fast and controllable while still being able to play the game. But while you're doing that, you also have to realize that not all your specs are created equal, right? If you say you want to have a really, really fast robot, but you also want your robot to be able to push really, really hard, those things are pretty much trade-offs based on what we have in motors. So there are ways that you can get around some of that, but if you're using the same motors and you're gearing them differently, we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later too, you pretty much have to choose if you want to be really fast or if you want to have a lot of power. Same with being able to reach really high, but also be able to go under a low bar like you have to do in some FRC games. There's a lot of trade-offs that you have to play around with. High center of gravity compared to reaching high, those types of things. A lot of times when you're comparing them, you want to figure out how much does it actually take, how much does it help you to win a match. But you also have to look at cost too. There may be a great system, but it costs too much for your team to be able to do. But another thing, it gets you most of the way there and it's really cheap. Time, volume's one that people forget about a lot. There's only so much volume on a robot. If you can do something in a smaller space, it's probably better because you're gonna run out of room at some point. Most of the time, the easy stuff that's worth a lot is the best to do. So if you can do something that is really, really simple, you can accomplish it in a couple days, you can make sure it's perfect, it works every single time, and it gives you a lot of points, those are gonna be really valuable to your team. In that same realm we were just talking about as well, you have a lot of different trade-offs. It may be great to have a robot that's really complex and does this thing really, really well, but if you build it and you take all 45 days to build it and you get no time to practice, you may not be as good as somebody who builds a really simple robot, maybe can't do as much stuff as your other robot can, but they can drive the heck out of it and they know exactly what to do and it's all muscle memory, they can do it blindfolded and score all the points. That may be a much better way to do it. Same with reliability versus complexity. Simpler robots that don't break, you don't have an issue. Missing matches hurts you more than anything in FRC. It's much better to build a robot that constantly performs and can be put out on the field and play well every single time, instead of building something that's really complex and cool but only works every 5th match. Okay, so now go through, try to go through as your groups and actually look at ranking the specifications that you came up with and figuring out what are going to be important, where your cost-benefit analysis are, and what are some things that may have to be trade-offs, and then start talking about them and figuring out where you're going to prioritize. Please let me know if you have any questions too. I'll come around. All right, everybody. All right, so that go pretty successful. Not too many arguments about where things are ranked. People doing reasonably well? Yes. Feedback, don't actually, can't read minds. There we go. Yes, okay. Thank you. All right, so anybody want to share some of their specifications and ranks? Anybody? All right. Okay.
So we decided that we don't want to be too fast towards PS8.
Hold on one second. I don't think people either speak louder or use a mic. Your choice. Yeah.
Okay, so we decided that our speed is going to be, the demand is 8 feet per second, and then we really wanted to be tall. We said that we wanted it to go up to the 3rd level of the thing. And then we have to have the manage that it rotates and a little gravity center. Gravity.
Oh.
Oh yeah, and in order to get to the third level, we are trying to figure out if we can do like a retractability type thing, and see if we can somehow allow us to retract our device that allows us to go to the various different racks, the first, second, third. So.
Okay. All right. Other people want to share? We'll come back.
Give it to the rookie.
Give it to. There were chairs in my way. There we go. I think it's on. All right. All right.
Shh. So we're going to focus on speed and say that we're going to go into the bottom rack. So our demand is we're going to make a lightweight robot with speed and probably travel around like maybe get 6 in 2 minutes. So that would be like 64 points. And like if you focus on the bottom rack, you won't have to take the time to go up because it could be more time to reach for the top racks. While these simpler would be faster, just go for the bottom. You wouldn't have to raise your robot.
Okay. That's a lot of really good points. So when you're looking at trade-offs and things, being able to build something, somebody's going to have to score tubes on the bottom rack. Might as well be you, right? If that's the easy value, if they're all worth the same, it's very valuable to be able to score those bottom racks. It's actually part of what you're looking at is how you're going to play into an alliance. So if you do have a team, like if they're trying to build a robot that's really tall and is hanging on the top racks, it makes a lot of sense to have for them to try to play with a team that's hanging on the lower rack because it's going to be harder for them if they have a big arm to actually get down low and hang on those low racks. If you want to bring the microphone up, I think Diana has something to say.
Okay, so we decided we wanted to play offense most of the time, focused on the tube. So we demand a fast drivetrain of at least 14 feet per second, with a preferred 16 feet per second. And we demand to reliably be able to pick up and place tubes anywhere on the rack, which I prefer to be really fast at that. And then wish if we have space or time or resources to do the end game.
Okay. All right, so how did people prioritize the end game? Was it more important, less important than the tubes? Less important? Okay.
I think that the end was, if you're scoring really bad in the main game, but the end game might save you.
Okay. Okay, so a lot of times when you're doing this, you want to be asking questions to your team when you're doing the brainstorming actually at kickoff. So how many tubes do you have to score to outscore the highest end game?
What do you mean by highest end game? Like just the
60 points.
60 points? Oh.
4.
6.
You have to score 4.
No.
5 in a row. But you have to get a row of 5. So minimum you have to score 5 tubes.
You
Right?
get a row of 4.
To outscore
It's
60.
15.
It's 30 both robots.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then you have to get a row of, okay, 5. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a pretty big number for a lot of matches, depending on skill level and things like that. So one of the things that in most games, and not all games, but in most games, people outscore themselves in their head. They think that teams are going to be far better than they actually are. When you actually look at points in games, there were pretty regularly, and one of the games in 2010 was a soccer game called Breakaway, and you had to kick soccer balls into a goal. The number of matches that ended in a 0-0 tie were astonishing. You would be shocked. Most games don't end in 0-0 ties. But that year there were enough. You were scoring 1 or 2 goals in a match and you were winning matches pretty regularly. So that was one of the harder games that FRC has ever given. But even in most general games in 2007, scores were not nearly as high as you would expect them to be. So really quickly, looking at scoring analysis, what do people think would be like the best scores in this game? Where do you think teams are scoring when they're playing against other good teams?
I would say mostly in 80s or 90s.
Okay. 80s and 90s? 70s?
70s.
Okay. All right. Okay, so one of the things we can look at, because we have we have the advantage of this happening 7 years ago. One of the websites that keeps a lot of stats is called thebluealliance.com. So it has basically every match score from every year, pretty much ever, going back to 2002 or so, which is all of FRC that you really need to know about. Before then, it was really crazy. We can look at the history later if people want to. That's not even remotely what I wanted to type. I don't know what I was doing. That's what I wanted to type. Actually, nope, that's not even what I wanted to type. That's what I wanted to type. There we go. Now we're getting closer. Okay. In 1987, they won champs in 2007. So they're a team out of Las Vegas called the High Rollers. They're a very good team. Coming in on Einstein. So they're Einstein level scores. So these are literally the best you can do against good competition. We're down in the 50s. At one point, they were held to 34, right? So literally, a double lift wins you most matches. You get 2 robots up 12 inches, you win most matches. If you're really looking at that, it's a pretty high priority. It's a really hard thing to do to get 2 robots up 12 inches, but the teams who could do it were extremely valuable. Whether you could hang tubes or not, if you could figure out a way where you had ramps or lifts or something that could do that, you were very, very valuable. And these are scores at championships where they had 50, they only scored 8 in one match, probably because their lift failed. Because one of the reasons why they won the whole thing is 190 was a double lift. So yeah, in general, when you're approximating scores, most of the time you want to approximate everything and then dial it back a bit, and then dial it back a bit more probably. Because teams are just not as good as we give them credit for. Building a robot to score points in a very, very short amount of time, we only have 2.5 minutes. Like your robot may be able to put up way more tubes than that if you had a long time, but not very often later.
Isn't this kind of refer to what you said earlier about you've got to plan for what level competition you want to be at? Because at the regional level, you're going to have robots that have trouble driving around the field. So you can put down a ramp and they can't get up.
That is true.
So it's worth nothing.
That is true. So it depends on where you're at, but in a certain match. But if you can, if you can get on a alliance that has 2 robots that can drive up your ramp at a regional, 60 points will win you that regional most of the time, right? So you just have to find 2 robots out of 60 that can drive up your ramp. So you may not win every qual match, but if your goal is to win the regional, then you're okay. If your goal is to 1 seed, which normally happens based on how many wins you get in the quals, it may be different.
What about, like, for example, if you do like a double lift system and then you have like a plow type of a thing that just kind of plows in the other robots, like whether they can drive or not, just kind of like...
That gets into a robot design and feasibility thing, and we're not quite there yet. So there's a lot of going through when you're ranking specs, looking at the actual game and looking at game analysis and how the scoring is going to be is really critical. That same problem happened in 2013 in the game we looked at, Ultimate Ascent, where they were shooting frisbees. Climbing seemed like, in the same vein, that 30 points for climbing, a lot of people were actually pushed in that direction where they thought, oh, the end game's always really important. For a lot of games, they were kind of like this. If you had a really good end game, you could win matches. And they focused very heavily on that 30-point climb. It turns out climbing that pyramid is extremely difficult. Very, very hard. So the teams that were even able to do it couldn't do it fast enough to where they could outscore the teams putting in discs. There were a few that could, and those were the very, very elite. But the teams that could only climb the pyramid, it took 2 minutes to do it, and getting 30 points, didn't have the analysis of the game right that time. Where in this game, most of the time, the ramp can get you pretty far. The ramp, lift, whatever. But it's also very hard to do too. And a lot of teams tried it, a lot of teams weren't successful. Where tubes, you can pretty successfully do something like the robot they were talking about. Getting a single tube on a rack is very doable. And again, for today's competition or for today's design work and stuff, feel free to keep going down your design path for whatever robot you were doing. Again, you don't actually have to build these. One of the nice things about today is you get to have